On the first day of a new class, one of my film professors told his students, "You are about to see the greatest single shot in all of cinema, but you won't know what's so great about it until the end of term." That's when he showed us this clip, a 9-minute sequence where a man slowly and quietly tries to carry a burning candle across a moldy old sulfur pool. When the clip finished, we all looked at each other in amused bewilderment. Surely he didn't mean that this excruciatingly long and tedious bit of film that we all struggled to get through without dying of boredom was actually a greater scene than, say, that poignant final shot of the Searchers, or the tense opening crane shot from Touch of Evil. But he was right, and by the end of the term, most of us understood why. That was my introduction to one of the most poetic filmmakers who ever lived, Andrei Tarkovsky.
They would have you murdered. All you'll ever be.
I had hoped to be here to tell you about Solaris in person, but now you'll just have to settle for my voice. I know why you've come to the station. You want to shut it down for good. You think solaristics is a fruitless and expensive science, but there are things here we don't understand. Surely you've seen them. The visitors? They are not hallucinations, and soon you'll have your very own. They come somehow from the ocean below, and whatever you do, you cannot allow the others to irradiate it. I am sorry I did not last, but I want you to remember one thing. Right now, you are the only sane person on Solaris Station.
In the late 1960s, the rising star of Soviet cinema, Andrei Arsenyevich Tarkovsky, whose first feature film, Ivan's Childhood, had been awarded the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, was facing a problem. His most recent film, Andrei Rublev, was being held back from release by Soviet authorities that wanted to heavily censor and change it. His finances were failing, as was his first marriage, as evidenced by the fact that he'd been living with another woman, and he knew he needed to make a new film. He submitted a screenplay for a semi-autobiographical film called A White, White Day that was summarily rejected. It would later become Mirror. So he needed to come up with something relatively uncontroversial, and he needed to do it fast. Enter Stanislaw Lem, a Polish sci-fi novelist and philosopher who was in relatively good standing with the Soviet Union, given that many of his early works, written under ideological duress, embraced socialist realism and themes favorable to communism. Arguably his most famous work, Solaris, found its way to Tarkovsky a few years earlier, recommended to the director by none other than its future star, Natalya Bondarchuk. Tarkovsky, who ultimately liked the book, felt that its popularity and Lem's higher standing with the Soviet authorities would make it more appealing to them, and so, with a green light from Goskino, the State Committee for Cinematography, he and Lem corresponded while Tarkovsky also hired the Ukrainian writer Friedrich Gorenstein to help put together a screenplay. Tarkovsky felt that it was important to focus on the emotional and thematic core of the story, rather than getting bogged down by the details. He was highly critical of Western science fiction, where, in his mind, the storytelling spirit had been snuffed out by technology and futurism. Contrary to popular belief, he did like the genre. He just preferred so-called soft sci-fi, where the focus remains on character, philosophy, and social issues. Despite the novel taking place entirely aboard a space station, 2/3 of the initial draft took place on Earth. This script made other drastic changes to the source material as well, including the introduction of a second wife for the protagonist, much to the annoyance of Lem, who, under the terms of his contract, was able to reject it and send Tarkovsky back to the metaphorical drawing board. Even though Lem wasn't completely satisfied with subsequent drafts, he continued to work with Tarkovsky from a distance and eventually gave him the okay to proceed. Sometime prior to the start of filming, Tarkovsky held a screening of 2001: A Space Odyssey for cast and crew, at the end of which he explained that he wanted Solaris to avoid copying it at all costs. He had a low opinion of Stanley Kubrick's film, feeling it represented everything wrong with the Western approach to science fiction. Therefore, in deference to Tarkovsky, a director I respect as much as Kubrick, I will neither argue this point nor talk about the various similarities between the two movies. I'm going to discuss the cast now, but I want you to know that I'm probably going to butcher some of these pronunciations. I've tried my best, but some of these names are, let's say, testing my limits. To play the lead role of Chris Kelvin, Tarkovsky brought in the Lithuanian actor Donatas Banionis, whose role in the 1968 Soviet spy film Dead Season may have inspired a young Vladimir Putin to join the KGB. Banionis found Tarkovsky frustrating to work with at first, because the director took a hands-off approach to his actors, believing that actors give more authentic performances when they don't really know what the final film will look like. The actor would later praise Tarkovsky's style, however, and came to appreciate his unconventional methods. Meanwhile, the role of Snout is filled by the Estonian Jüri Jarvet, who wasn't particularly fluent in Russian and thus had to do a lot of post-production ADR. For lengthy dialogue scenes, Tarkovsky frequently filmed the actor from behind to make this easier. Opposite him as the reclusive Sartorius is Tarkovsky's staple Anatoly Solzhenitsyn, who had previously appeared in Andrei Rublev and would go on to appear in several more Tarkovsky films before his untimely death in 1982. On Solaris, Tarkovsky pretended to be overly critical of the actor's performance, to keep him off balance. Rounding out the male cast are Vladislav Dvorzhetsky as Burton, Nikolai Grinko as Chris's father, and this guy as Dr. Jabarian. However, the true standout performance of the film belongs to Natalya Bondarchuk, who plays the various versions of Chris's deceased wife Hari. Daughter of the famous Soviet filmmaker Sergei Bondarchuk, Natalya first auditioned for the role in 1970, but Tarkovsky rejected her as being too young. After seeing her performance in the following year's You and Me, however, he was so impressed that he decided to give her the part after all. She was only 18 at the time. Despite becoming a major respected figure in Russian cinema to this very day, she still considers Hari to be her best role. Also worth noting are Tamara Ogorodnikova, who had helped get Tarkovsky's previous film Andrei Rublev released after years of red tape, as the enigmatic Anna, and Tarkovsky's own stepdaughter, Olga Kizilova, as Gabarian's scantily dressed child visitor. Filming on Solaris began in late 1970, primarily at Mosfilm for the interiors and at Zvenigorod for the dacha scenes. The lengthy car ride was filmed in Tokyo and was supposed to be a showcase of a city of the future, though the original plan to film at the more impressive World Expo fell through. As a sad testament to the state of Soviet infrastructure in the early 70s, this sequence was allegedly still seen in the Soviet Union as looking futuristic. As for why it goes on for so painfully long, outside of that just being Tarkovsky's style, the audio commentary on the Criterion release suggests it needed to be that long in order to justify the expense of a trip to Tokyo. This is because the budget of the film was constantly being slashed from an original promise of 1,850,000 rubles down to a final budget of just 900,000 rubles. This made things increasingly difficult for Tarkovsky, even though it was never his intention to turn Solaris into the kind of special effects spectacle he so criticized from Western cinema. A good chunk of the budget went to sets of the station itself, designed to be lived in, abandoned, and on the brink of a total breakdown, perhaps anticipating the direction science fiction would start to go in towards the end of the decade. Reportedly, famed Japanese director Akira Kurosawa once visited the set and was profoundly impressed by what he saw. He would later call Solaris one of his favorite films. Tarkovsky had initially suggested an entirely ambient score devoid of music, but was ultimately persuaded by composer Eduard Artemyev to include a subtle orchestral theme based around a Bach prelude. This orchestral score gradually transforms throughout the movie into something more electronic, highlighting the contrast between the natural world of the first act and the cold artificiality of the station. As with Andrei Rublev before it, Tarkovsky struggled with the Goskino bureaucrats on releasing his final cut unmolested by censorship. The authorities turned in a long list of around 40 suggested edits that included a more coherent narrative, more overt praise of the Soviet system and less veiled criticism of it, a happier ending, no references to God or Christianity, more special effects, and the excising of a mildly suggestive scene where Hari enters Chris's bed. Thankfully, due to his growing international clout, the director was ultimately able to ignore Goskino's suggestions, and, after making a few minor cuts of his own volition, managed to release his vision of the film. Solaris premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 1972, where it won the Grand Prix Special Jury Prize. It premiered in Moscow the following February and had an international run throughout the next few years, including in America. Though Tarkovsky himself was deeply dissatisfied with the film, later in life calling it his greatest failure, and despite Stanislaw Lem pretty much hating everything about it, Solaris quickly became Tarkovsky's most famous film, now finding itself on several prestigious lists of greatest films ever made. In 2002, the novel was adapted a second time by Steven Soderbergh, resulting in a more Hollywood version that bombed at the box office and is remembered as little more than a footnote in the pages of cinematic history. Tarkovsky would return to science fiction with 1979's Stalker, but let's save that for another video. As for me, I find this film a profound and emotional experience, and I would definitely rank it high on my list of best films of all time. But of course, as an undeniably pretentious art film, I wouldn't recommend it to everyone. Therefore, before I get into analyzing it, let's take a step back and talk about Tarkovsky in more general terms, as an auteur. Andrei Tarkovsky is one of those directors who strove to define film as its own form of high art, distinct and separate from all other forms that came before it, though certainly borrowing elements of each. He believed that, for a film to have value, it had to be something that could only be expressed through the medium, which is why he was never interested in making a straight adaptation of Lem's novel, which he considered tantamount to adding a supplemental illustration rather than producing a unique work of art. As Tarkovsky saw it, film was a profound reflection of human experience, something that used time, imagery, and sound in a way completely unlike anything else that man has created. I know that all sounds esoteric and grandiose, but put simply, he thought movies should add something new, not regurgitate other forms of art. As such, he had his own idiosyncratic approaches to filmmaking, rejecting the far more common montage methods pioneered by Sergei Eisenstein and preferring to let time breathe. Few filmmakers make as many demands on an audience's patience as Tarkovsky, but for me, I find a lot to admire in his stream of consciousness way of panning the camera around instead of relying on reverse shots and editing, his deliberate focus on natural movement, quiet tension, and seemingly irrelevant details, his refusal to adhere to traditional narrative structure, and his use of recurring symbolism throughout all of his films, though he always denied that last part. To understand Tarkovsky's approach to Lem's novel, you need to recognize where its themes align with his own cinematic aspirations. Tarkovsky didn't believe that movies have to be understood, that digging into the details and trying to puzzle out a story's meaning or an individual scene's significance is a worthwhile endeavor. He wanted his films to be felt and experienced, not understood. As for Lem's novel, it concerns itself with the insurmountable gap between human intelligence and a truly alien one. The ocean is never understood or properly explained in the novel, because Lem was trying to comment on the unknowability of the universe. It's never explained in the film, because Tarkovsky was trying to demonstrate an emotional truth that transcends reason. Despite the two men firmly disagreeing about what Solaris means, these two viewpoints are far more similar than they are contradictory. For the longest time, having only seen the film and not read the book, I always thought Snout's speech about man needing a mirror came from Tarkovsky, even though that speech is ripped practically word for word from Lem. That's how alike their views really are. Now, while I do love the poetic nature of a Tarkovsky film like Solaris, specifically because of Tarkovsky's belief in this regard, I don't jive with the dismissal of intellectual pursuits or analysis. I wouldn't be here analyzing movies if I did. So, with that in mind, buckle your seatbelts, because we're going to dive into the question of what Solaris actually means. Hey, do you have a sci-fi classic you want me to cover? Why don't you drop it in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. If you'd like to support what I do even more, please consider joining my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. I'm also the co-host of a couple of different podcasts, the streaming HEAP and From Here to Paternity, and I have a novel called Paradox that is available through Amazon. If all else fails though, you can always check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of plenty more sci-fi classics in both film and literature. Now then, with all that shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's move on. There are a lot of interesting ways to interpret this movie, and I'm not going to go over all of them. The most compelling interpretation, for me at least, is that it's about the transcendent power of human emotion. The visitors are mirrors of the characters that spawn them. We don't know much about Snout's unseen visitor other than it is violent and that Snout is ashamed of it. Thus, you could probably see it as his primal id. As for Hari, she comes out of Chris's guilt over his wife's self-elimination, something he blames himself for because he was incapable of loving her. Therefore, falling in love with the visitor Hari, at least the one he didn't eject into space, is a way to redeem himself, to purge the guilt and come back to humanity. You see, the story of Solaris is really about Chris, a character who, in the wake of his wife's death, became a cold and distant man, an accountant, as Burton puts it. When he gets to the station, he is reborn, using one of Tarkovsky's favorite motifs, physically tripping into a new life, learning to abandon his old way of thinking, now represented by the heartless Sartorius, by rekindling the love he never got from his mother. Sorry to interrupt, but while I was editing this scene, I noticed that if you look at it, this is a flashback, and that's his mom, and she's holding an unlit cigarette, which could represent her lack of passion. And that scene then immediately pans over, and what do you see? You see Chris, as a child, literally carrying kindling. I mean, come on, that's pretty good, right? And never really had for his wife. The contrast between the natural world of Earth and the confined, antiseptic world of the station only highlights this change. Chris has become as broken and sterile as his new surroundings, and the subtle reminders of the world he left behind, expressed in props that irrationally exist in both places, help him to repair the damage and become a complete human being. Yes, he loses Hari in the end, but in so doing, he is able to move forward in a more spiritually healthy way. He danced on the edge of nihilism, nearly lost himself to nostalgia and obsession, and in the end has been cleansed of his impurities. Now that brings me to the end, which is the subject of much contention among people like myself who want to dissect the film against Tarkovsky's wishes. Aside from the many artistic allusions at play, such as the recreation of Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son, I think the key to understanding this confusing final scene is realizing that the Chris we see here isn't Chris at all, but rather another recreation from the Solaris Ocean as it struggles to understand humanity. This island, constructed from Chris's memories, isn't where Chris ends his story, because I firmly believe he does return to Earth in the end. It is instead the ocean finding its own emotional closure, hollow and imperfect in imitation though it may be. Regardless of how you interpret the film, or even if you want to interpret it at all, Solaris is a film you have to experience in your own way, ideally more than once. If you can allow Tarkovsky to hypnotize you, the movie will make complete emotional sense, even if it is deliciously maddening to comprehend. It is pure artistic cinema, something truly rare, and as such, it is without a doubt a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Are you a fan of pretentious art movies? Let me know in the comments, and hit those buttons already. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll discuss the true story of an undead abomination, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
Слышите вы?
Уходите.